Number 80. This is 8.6, Early Steps in the Civil Rights Movement, 1940s and 1950s. So there are going to be two civil rights lectures in this unit, and we're going to go through this one today and come back to the other one, to the later 1960s civil rights movement in a couple of lectures. And the theme that we're going into today is social structures, because the way in which different groups in society are treated and the hierarchies that are created, discrimination that is instituted, all deals with social structures. One learning objective that is explain how and why the civil rights movement developed and expanded from 1945 to 1960. And the key concept says, seeking to fulfill Reconstruction era promises, civil rights activists and political leaders achieved some legal and political successes in ending segregation, although progress towards racial equality was slow. So to begin, we need to be clear on what it was that the civil rights movement was trying to confront, what it was trying to end. So Jim Crow laws across the South would create separate facilities for African Americans and whites. And these were instituted by state and local laws. So these weren't necessarily federal laws that were separating people. It was the individual states and individual cities, and it happened all across the United States, in the South, the West, parts of the North. Discrimination was not just a Southern thing. And these Jim Crow laws had been allowed to continue because of the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. In that ruling, it established a separate but equal doctrine, meaning that as long as separate facilities are being provided for African Americans, then the people, establishment, or business in question was not infringing upon the 14th Amendment right of equal protection under the law. Another thing that African Americans were trying to battle was disenfranchisement. So disenfranchisement means that your voting rights are being taken away or they're being suppressed. People are having a harder time accessing their right to vote. And this was critical because we saw during the Reconstruction era that when African Americans were allowed to vote, they voted for black politicians that would represent them in Congress and in state legislatures. And voting really it's a powerful tool in a democracy like the United States. And so when that was taken away across the South at the end of Reconstruction and through the early 20th century, the discrimination would be more easily able to continue. If voting rights were reinstituted and more easily accessible, then the inequality would start to go away because African Americans would be able to elect politicians and leaders that would represent them and keep segregatory legislation from being passed. We saw discrimination in housing, banking, and employment through our discussion of the GI Bill and its access that it gave to veterans to mortgages. We talked about how African Americans were less likely to be able to use those benefits because even though that mortgage would be backed by the federal government, they still needed to access a bank that would let them borrow that money, and some banks would not lend to African Americans. If they were able to secure a mortgage, then there would be limited places where they could live because new suburban developments like Levittowns would not sell homes to black families. And then another thing that we'll see is that as the civil rights movement starts to gain some success, especially in the decision of Brown versus the Board of Education, there's going to be a backlash from white citizens' councils. These started in the state of Mississippi, and they took part in activities of voter suppression, violent and economic harassment, and they even created council schools. So these were private school options that the councils would come up with in order to keep a school from being integrated. You see their logo on the right. It incorporates the flag of the Confederacy, and it also has some of the lost cause ideology of the states' rights and racial integrity. So this is what they view as maintaining the integrity of the white race. All right, so the early civil rights activists and leaders that you should be familiar with. So Congress of Racial Equality, we talked about this in the previous period. They were created in the 1940s. James Farmer is one of the co-founders. Farmer will be very important going forward because he will actually end up working with U.S. presidents to try and end segregation and discrimination in the United States. You are probably already familiar with Martin Luther King Jr. and his group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The NAACP has its roots back to the late 19th century, created by W.E.B. Du Bois. In the 1940s and 50s, it is being headed by Roy Wilkins, seen there in the middle. Rosa Parks was an NAACP secretary when she said that she wasn't going to get up and give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, which led to the Montgomery bus boycott. We also have the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, the LCCR, and that's led by A. Philip Randolph. His group is not quite as memorable, but A. Philip Randolph's impact really is. He is the one that lobbied President Franklin Roosevelt in order to try and get the segregation to end in the defense industries during the war. And it will be his dream realized in the 1960s to have a large-scale march on Washington for civil rights and black employment. The Council of Negro Women, that was headed by Dorothy Height, seen in the bottom left there, taking a picture with Eleanor Roosevelt. Dorothy Height is one of the most important civil rights leaders, and because she was a woman, other civil rights leaders later said that that's why she did not gain as much prominence, because there was a degree of sexism and a expectation that it was men that would be leading the movement. But Dorothy Height was able to bring a lot of her influence in the civil rights movement. And then finally, the National Urban League with Whitney Young on the bottom right. He will also work very closely with the Nixon administration to try and get better opportunities for African Americans in the 1960s and 70s. All right, so now we're going to move on to the successes. So that's the key concept is talking about. So one success that we see outside of these boycotts and court cases is Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier in baseball in 1947. That was a really big deal because at this point in U.S. history, African Americans have the Negro League because they're not allowed to play in the National Baseball League, in the MLB. But Jackie Robinson's entry into the Brooklyn Dodgers and his dominance as a baseball player really shows that the African Americans should be able to play in the major leagues, and then those who were having to play in the Negro leagues because of their skin color probably could have been really good Hall of Famers if they were to have played in the major leagues. And that's why most recently the Major League Baseball has now adopted all of the Negro League records as Major League records. And the Montgomery bus boycott. So this happened in 1954, and Rosa Parks, like we said, did not give up her seat from the bus that she was riding in Montgomery, Alabama, and she's arrested for it. You see on the bottom center the diagram of the bus. This was 1956. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Of where she was sitting and why she refused to give up her seat. The boycott that resulted out of this lasted 381 days. The black community in Montgomery made up about 70% of the ridership of the public transportation, and they were having to put up with being discriminated against. So they said that they were going to find other means of transportation until the Montgomery City and the Montgomery Transportation Authority were willing to integrate the buses. And it ended with a Supreme Court's decision. I included another activist, Joanne Gibson Robinson. She's also a Montgomery activist. She went to jail many times, was arrested many times for activism and civil rights. She participated in the Montgomery bus boycott and organizing people, getting rides from one place to another, raising money so that the boycott could continue. And she will continue to be an important figure in the civil rights movement, especially in Alabama. All right, so now the path to desegregation. The three branches of the federal government used measures including desegregation of the armed services and Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954 to promote greater racial equality. So for the legislature, this is Congress, they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, and this is going to establish a commission on civil rights. 1957 means that it was Dwight Eisenhower who was president and signed it into law. At the time, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who will become vice president under JFK and then president after he is assassinated, at this point is in the House of Representatives, and he's a top figure in the Democratic Party. And he views this civil rights bill as a threat to the coalition of the Democratic Party, because the Southern Democrats don't want this to pass or don't want this to be enforced. And so Johnson does a lot to take away some of the provisions that would have made it a very effective Civil Rights Act. And it's ironic that whenever he's president in 1964, he will sign into law a much more robust Civil Rights Act with more ways of enforcement to make sure that civil rights are being upheld in the United States. The judicial measures that we see in the 1940s and 50s is the use of litigation to try and end some of the discrimination and segregation. And this starts with Westminster versus Mendez. And this is a court case in 1947 out of California. It starts at the district court level, and it will eventually be appealed to the Circuit Court of Appeals. It won't reach the Supreme Court, but it's the first real success of ending segregation in schooling. It's out of Orange County, California. Westminster Unified School District, along with many other school districts around the area in Orange County, were being sued by Mexican family who was accusing the district of segregating Hispanic and Mexican students into what they called Mexican schools. And of course, they had less opportunities at these schools. They had a worse level of education, and they were not being given the same amount of resources as the white counterparts that were able to go to the regular schools. And they ruled on behalf of the Mendez family. But before the Supreme Court was able to get this case, the governor of California, Earl Warren, helped pass a law to end segregation in California. So that's the only reason why this one didn't reach the Supreme Court, is because it was technically not going to be an issue after the state ended segregation on its own. So that's when we get to 1954 in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. The NAACP lawyer Thurgood Marshall had been aware of the Westminster versus Mendez case and saw the argument that they had made in order to win their case in the district court level. And he made a very similar argument, saying that separate facilities are inherently unequal for the segregated class or the segregated group. Linda Brown, who is the girl who was at the center of the case, ends up being able to integrate her school in Kansas. And they presented a lot of scientific evidence about how the segregated class ends up having negative psychological effects instilled in them, that they view themselves negatively and they view themselves as inherently bad. So they were continuing to instill this racial way of thinking to the people that were being segregated. And we have a lot of other Supreme Court cases that the College Board doesn't mention, but they might be good to remember if you're ever needing to include outside evidence. The court case Smith versus Albright ends the practice of all white primaries. So political parties in the primary season were able to discriminate against black voters. And so when the general election came around, the black voters did not have a chance of choosing who would have been in that general election because they were chosen in the primary. So all white primaries are unconstitutional under Smith versus Albright. In Shelley versus Kramer, this outlaws the practice of using restrictive covenants. So in deeds of homes, the original homeowner could say that the house or the territory or the piece of land that is owned by that deed can only be sold to white Americans and cannot be sold to African Americans. And so again, that's unconstitutional, and it is labeled as such in Shelley versus Kramer. And then the last one is Morgan versus Virginia. This is going to outlaw segregation in buses that are crossing state lines. So interstate bus travel must be integrated, that there cannot be any sort of segregation. You can't have African Americans sit in the back or sit in a worse seat than you would offer a white American. And even though it was decided in the 1950s, early 1950s, it's not going to really be implemented and enforced until the 1960s, when we begin to see the freedom rides. So students across the country will take these rides on buses across state lines, and they will try to integrate the bus and will force the federal government to protect them so that this Supreme Court case could be enforced. All right, and then finally the executive action. So we have two presidents in this period from the 1940s to the 1950s. That's Truman and Eisenhower. Truman strengthened the Civil Rights Division when he was president in the Justice Department, so they're better able to prosecute civil rights cases to try and maintain equality. And he ends discrimination of the armed forces through Executive Order 9981. Eisenhower was president during the integration of Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas. The governor, Orville Faubus, wanted to continue to keep segregating Little Rock public schools and was willing to stop the integration of this high school. And because of that, Eisenhower was forced to send in the Arkansas National Guard that he federalized in order to protect these 9 students that were trying to attend classes. And you see a picture of what it looked like on Time magazine. This was quite a big crisis because it was a big standoff, and the president wanted to show that this was going to be the new way going forward. And if it came to violence, then he was going to use the resources of the federal government in order to uphold the law of the land, which had been decided in Brown versus the Board in 1954. All right, so that's it. To recap, early activism yielded some successes. We saw that in Jackie Robinson and the Montgomery bus boycott. All branches of government were used to win gains. That's executive, legislative, and judicial. And Truman desegregated the military. That's specifically mentioned by the College Board key concept, and so is the Brown versus the Board of Education court case, which overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal doctrine. All right, thank you for watching. We have just a couple more lectures left. We're getting to the very end of it, so keep coming back until the very end, and I'll see you on the next one.